Well, thank you very much. This is a real, it's not only an honor, but it's also a real pleasure for me to be here, because one of the things that Professor Hernandez did not say was the fact that I actually taught at UIC for 8 years, and coming here is like coming home, especially when I see Professor Saona and Professor Compton. These are people that were very kind to me when I was here, and it's just a great delight to be here and to see you all. So I would like to thank the School of Literature. I'm going to forget the whole work. The literatures, cultural studies, and linguistics for yay! That school did not exist when I was here, so this is a new thing for me to learn. I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me, Professor Saona, who's now chair of the department, and Professor Hernandez, who extended the invitation for me to come. And thank you so much for being here. I know that. It is a Friday, and this is a long paper, so I'll beg your patience with it as I read it. Now, as all of you know, as all of we know by now, gender as a category of research has opened up new roads in all areas, not least for the early modern period. And indeed, feminist criticism has illuminated the role of women, whether as literary figures or as authors in Golden Age literature. And you'll see that I do still use the term Golden Age, but I vary with early modern. And there's a, you can ask me afterwards if you'd like, you know, why we still hold to Golden Age. Of Spain's male writers, Cervantes has received the most attention from feminists. This has to be not only for his stature as a world-renowned author, but because of the many women characters who populate his novels. And my talk today, will focus on two issues. I'd like first to historicize feminist criticism of Cervantes, to give credit to the feminists who first brought his female protagonists from out of the shadows. But I also want to discuss whether, in fact, we can assume that Cervantes himself was either intentionally or perhaps accidentally a feminist. Now, the 400th anniversaries of Don Quixote in 2005 and 2015, of the Novelas Ejemplares in 2013, and of the Persiles y Sigismunda just this year, have generated a great deal of scholarship by both Spanish and American feminists. As an example, the approximately 50 essays that appeared in Spanish scholar Fanny Rubio's two collections, El Quijote en clave de mujer, that published in 2005 and 2007, respectively, teased out the themes of sexuality, desire, agency, and freedom that they saw in the novel. The majority of the contributors in these two volumes defended what they considered Cervantes' progressive humanism. They compared his works to the misogynist texts of the period to show how he attempts to give voice to women who criticized their social role, with one critic affirming that Cervantes had created a possibilist utopia, una utopia posibilista, in which his female protagonists could negotiate the limitations of their gender. In 2005, the American scholar Lisa Wollendorf published her article, Cervantes and his women readers, in which she remarked on the protagonists' different ethnic categories, which she claims form part of the hybridity of early modern Spain. Emphasizing a historical approach, Wollendorf states that, perhaps because Cervantes was a writer for modern times, feminists, and this is a quote, feminists have been hesitant and occasionally divided in their engagement with his writing. I would say, yeah, they have been. And as an example, she cites Teresa Ann Sears, who, and I quote again, unabashedly criticizes readings of Cervantes as a proto-feminist, as willfully unnuanced. One American Cervantista, a male in this time, Eric Graff, in his 2007 book, Cervantes and Modernity, proposes feminism as one of the four most important values of modern civilization, along with tolerance, secularism, and materialism, all of which he signs directly to Cervantes' works. This critical strategy leads him to assert that Cervantes sets the stage for today's cosmopolitan world. Yet while complaining that feminist criticism, and I quote, remains ambivalent about authorial intention, he himself overlooks Cervantes' many ambiguities and labels him a Christian feminist, whatever that means, while accusing feminist critics of being dogmatic, as well as anti-authorial and theoretical in the extreme. I believe that these scholars' comments leave open to question Cervantes' conceivable feminism. They also bring up the complex and controversial notions of the author's opacity and his authorial control. Indeed, the assessment of Cervantes as a reformer whose purpose it is to combat misogyny makes us doubt whether his depiction of women were intended to propound a conscious critical position. By asking this, I do not mean to impose on Cervantes the tired cliché of ingenio lego, that is, the 19th century view of the author as an unschooled writer who could not grasp the significance of his textual production or the exploits of his diverse characters. Nor do I intend to place in doubt the author's brilliant use of intertextuality or the challenges of his writings to generic convention and to gender, race, racial, and religious strictures. But it is to call attention to the elaborate barriers that Cervantes sets up in order to distance himself from his readers and to ask whether the author's intentionality, in this case the authenticity of his ideology, must at some point remain unknown. Still, most critics have not stopped attributing to Cervantes a deliberateness that they claim grants his women protagonists a freedom rarely exercised by real women in early modern Spain. Let's look at three women in Don Quixote who have given critics the most material with which to applaud Cervantes' feminism, yet whose ambivalence remains evident in the narrative. How do you start this?
Sorry about that.
Okay. Okay. The first is Teresa Panza, Sancho Panza's reasonable, down-to-earth wife who tells her husband off on numerous occasions. In her practical, sensible way, she is to Sancho what Sancho is to Don Quixote. And here's another image. All the images I found of Teresa stress her role as a peasant woman. And the second slide that I found that I'm showing you is from a theater production in Mexico promoting Enrique Peña Nieto for president. If you'll see this stuff, Enrique Peña Nieto. I have no idea how Teresa Panza could help Peña Nieto in his search for the presidency of Mexico. But as we know, presidents get elected for very strange reasons. Like the good mother she is, Teresa stays home to care for her children, criticizing Sancho harshly in part 2 when she hears that he again wants to join the night to claim the governorship of an island. Eso no, marido mío. Viva la gallina, aunque sea con su pepita. Vivid vos y lleves el diablo cuantos gobiernos hay en el mundo. Sin gobierno saliste del vientre de vuestra madre, sin gobierno habéis vivido hasta ahora, y sin gobierno os llevarán a la sepultura. Sancho responds that claiming the governorship will help his children, especially their daughter, Sancha, who could then marry well and be called señora. To which Teresa answers, Me dio, Sancho, con vuestro estado, nos queráis alzar a mayores. Por cierto, qué gentil cosa sería casar a vuestra María, nuestra María, con un condazo o con un caballerote que cuando se le antojase la pusiese como nueva, llamándola de villana, hija de destripaterrones y de la peluca ruecas. No en mis días, marido, para eso no he criado yo a mi hija. Traed vos dinero, Sancho, y el casarla dejadlo a mi cargo, que allí está lo petocho, que le conocemos, y con este, que es nuestro igual, estará bien casada. Teresa is aware of how preposterous it is to attempt to marry their daughter to a nobleman. She has even criticized Don Quixote for assuming a higher social rank. Yo no sé quién le puso a él don, que no tuvieron sus padres ni sus abuelos. Yet when she receives a coral necklace from the Duchess, the gift seems to go to her head. She writes Sancho, Mi señora la duquesa te dirá el deseo que tengo de ir a la corte. Mírate en ello y avísame de tu gusto, que yo procuraré honrarte en ella andando en coche. Louise Cialella makes a good case for Teresa's use of proverbs in her discourse of domesticity as a productive and reproductive woman in charge of her workspace in the home. However, by expressing her wish to visit the court in a carriage, she and Sancho both fall prey to their desire to improve their social status, yet only Sancho is given the chance to fulfill his wish. The second female protagonist on whom I would like to focus is on Dorotea, the young farm girl who falls in love with Don Fernando, a rich, spoiled segundon who seduces her by convincing her that he has betrothed her in the presence of a religious image. And that's what's called a clandestine marriage, when just the man and the woman agree to be married, and all they had to do was say it in front of a crucifix. Though that kind of marriage was forbidden by the Council of Trent because it lent itself to doubt. It was always the woman's word against the man's. She would say, "But you married me," and he said, "I didn't marry you." There are no witnesses, right, to this kind of a marriage. So once she gives in to him, he soon abandons her to seduce yet another woman. When Dorotea sets out, cross-dressed as a man, to find Fernando, she comes into contact with a priest and the barber who are attempting to deceive Don Quixote to return to his home in La Mancha. She tricks the knight by pretending to be the princess Micomicona. I've elsewhere related that her story, which is in itself a kind of interpolated novel, deploys clandestine marriage not merely as a literary device to advance the plot, which it does, but as focus of Dorotea's rhetorical strategies and the self-fashioning of the female psyche. If clandestine marriage serves Fernando's purpose in seducing Dorotea, it also provides her the possibility of marrying into a higher social class. This is only one explanation, however, for her apparent concession to Fernando. Another is her desire that her parents suffer no dishonor. Dorotea thus embodies the social tensions brought about by a young woman's loss of virginity in a culture that fetishizes female chastity. She has been blamed by several male critics for her desire to better herself socially and before behaving as a scorned woman. Her acknowledgement that she was flattered and intrigued by Fernando's adulation has caused other male readers to assume her collusion in the seduction. Oops, okay. It's telling that the images of Dorotea, starting with Gustave Doré's two interpretations of 1863, in which he portrays her as more sensual than originally described in the text, become more seductive over time as her skirts get higher and she shows more leg. As I have argued elsewhere, Dorotea's tale is Cervantes' response to medieval Spain's most famous seduction story, La Celestina. In that novel, Melivea's fall to her death is both literal and allegorical. Her explicit sexual responsiveness is condemned for violating medieval moral codes. Cervantes' text of sexual seduction proceeds far more ambiguously. Rather than preach a directly didactic morality tale like the Celestina, Cervantes complicates the conventional seduction scene by telling it from the aggrieved woman's point of view. As Dorotea narrates her story, the roles of agency and desire become increasingly intermingled. Yet they will finally entrap both the author and his protagonist in a rhetorical web of social and literary conventions. Cervantes appears to concede to early modern Spain's misogynist social norms by having Dorotea marry the man who raped her. However, he breaks with the conventions of didactic narrative by presenting her as a fallen woman, but who remains, despite having been seduced, modest, chaste, and a worthy wife. The most significant part of Dorotea's narrative is the moment when she faces Fernando. Although she literally throws herself at his feet, she addresses Fernando with the informal pronoun tú, and her statement to him constitutes an illocutionary speech act through which she performs a legitimate marriage because they are surrounded by people. This is in public, and there is a priest in the audience as well. Tú quisiste que yo fuese tuya, aunque ahora quieras que no lo sea, no será posible que tú dejes de ser mía. En fin, Señor, Lo que últimamente te digo es que, quieras o no quieras, yo soy tu esposa. Almost sounds like a Mexican ranchera when she says that. Dorotea's strategy, while highly intelligent, is not subversive. It instead follows early modern norms that stipulate that a raped woman must marry her rapist. Her real accomplishments, in the end, are to have Fernando confess to his crime and to justify her pursuit of him by achieving a happy ending to her narrative. Don Quixote's most controversial woman protagonist, however, is Marcela, the rich farm girl dressed as a shepherdess who holds all the men in her village in her thrall. When one of her rejected suitors, Grisóstomo, commits suicide, she is called enemiga mortal del linaje humano by his best friend, who cries out to her, ¿vienes a ver por ventura, oh fiero basilisco de estas montañas, si con tu presencia vierten sangre las heridas de este miserable a quien tu crueldad quitó la vida? In responding, Marcela gives one of the most famous speeches of the novel. And although it's too long to repeat here in its entirety, it runs for 2 pages. I'll quote her main points. Yo no escogí la hermosura que tengo, que el cielo me la dio de gracia, sin yo pedirla ni escogerla. Y así como la víbora no merece ser culpada por la ponzoña que tiene, aunque con ella mata, por habérsela dado naturaleza, tampoco yo no merezco ser reprendida por ser hermosa. Si la honestidad es una de las virtudes que al cuerpo y al alma más adornan y hermosean, ¿por qué la he de perder? ¿Por qué la ha de perder la que es amada por hermosa, por corresponder a la intención de aquel que por solo su gusto, con todas sus fuerzas e industrias, procura que la pierda? Hombres necios que acusáis. After brilliantly arguing that men have no right to expect her to submit to a man solely because he is attracted to her beauty, she then gives her own explanation and defense of her actions. Yo nací libre, y para poder vivir libre, escogí la soledad de los campos. Los árboles de estas montañas son mi compañía, las claras aguas de estos arroyos mis espejos. Con los árboles y con las aguas comunico mis pensamientos y hermosura. A los que he enamorado con la vista he desengañado con las palabras. Marcela closes her speech by asserting that because she has no economic need to marry, she is therefore free to do as she pleases. Yo, como sabéis, tengo riquezas propias y no codicio las ajenas. Tengo libre condición y no gusto de sujetarme. But Marcela does not end there. She goes on to claim that she has no feelings for any man. Ni quiero ni aborrezco a nadie. No engaño a este, ni solicito a aquel, ni burlo con uno, ni me entretengo con el otro. Tienen mis deseos por término estas montañas, y si de aquí salen es a contemplar la hermosura del cielo, pasos con que camine el alma a su morada primera. With this, Marcela disappears into the woods, while Don Quixote guards her from being pursued by others. Although most male critics have been quick to condemn Marcela, feminist critics have rightly maintained that Cervantes, in this episode, undermines the male fantasy of the pastoral genre. Yet he also presents us with a doubly ambiguous female figure. Since she has money of her own, Marcela is not forced to marry. She is the measure of an independent woman, declaring to all that she has no need of men. However, because Marcela can live her own life as she desires and has no need of men, society in turn has no need of her. The images that illustrate this episode all made sure to elevate Marcela physically on a high promontory. This visual separation allegorizes the distance that she insists in maintaining between herself and the group of men who have come to bury Grisóstomo. But even if her speech is not what the men expected from her, she is placed immovably on a pedestal from which she can only dematerialize. Nonetheless, for many critics, Marcela, as Cervantes' most purportedly, I thought I had another one. Yes. Okay. Nonetheless, for many critics, Marcela, as Cervantes' most purportedly liberated woman, represents the author at his most feminist. The insistence on giving Cervantes a feminist mindset has a long history. And in this part of my presentation, I will be mentioning several scholars whose names have most likely have most likely been forgotten, but whose studies broke ground by focusing on Cervantes' women characters. In the first half of the 20th century, 3 Spanish women had already published studies on the women in Cervantes: the writer Concha Espina in 1916, Carmen Castro, Américo Castro's daughter, in 1953, and the philosopher María Zambrano in 1955. However, according to the Marxist critic Julio Rodríguez Puertolas, none of the 3 lived up to the epithet given them of pioneers. Indeed, he calls Espina's book, Mujeres del Quijote, clichés y vulgaridades de irremediable y definitiva tendencia a la cursilería, todo ello entreverado de notorios errores. The fact that Espina later became a member of the Falange did not endear her to Rodríguez Puertolas, who is the author of La Historia de la Literatura Fascista Española. In the United States, only 10 years after Concha Espina and several decades before feminism's second wave, Edith Cameron, a teacher of Spanish here in Chicago, published her article, Woman in Don Quixote, in which she laments that there was in her time nothing definite in the way of a scientific study of woman in Don Quixote. She also criticized Espina, complaining that the Spaniard treated women in a popular and romantic fashion. Marcela's rebellious attitude, however, convinced Cameron sufficiently to call her the first feminist in Spanish literature. Yet throughout her book, Cameron adheres to the perception that the author and his protagonist, Don Quixote, are essentially one and the same. She assigns to Cervantes a reverence for wifehood and motherhood, when it is, in fact, Don Quixote who rebukes Sancho when he speaks ill of Teresa, the mother of his children. Mal hace Sancho en decir mal de tu mujer, que en efecto es madre de tus hijos. She also believes that in the interpolated story of the Curioso Impertinente, Lotario speaks for Cervantes when he describes marriage as el divino sacramento que solo la muerte puede desatarlo. Now, Cervantes' own marriage was less than idyllic. He had fathered an illegitimate daughter when he married Catalina de Salazar, 18 years his junior, and with whom he never had any children. Soon after Cameron, 2 more books by women were published, both praised by Rodríguez Puertolas as far more deserving of the designation of pioneers in feminist studies. The American Sadie Trackman, who published Cervantes' Women of Literary Tradition in 1932, and the Spaniard María Pilar de Oñate, whose El Feminismo en la Literatura Española was published in 1938. Even before feminism's second wave, then, these three studies are examples of a liberal individualism and rationalism that, according to feminist philosopher Alison Jagger, contains the problematic concept of autonomy and, to an extent, egotism, to which liberal feminism has aspired for both men and women. Several decades afterward, Ruth L. Safar, who taught most of her life here at UIC, became the most influential critic in U.S. Hispanic feminism. She admitted that her 1984 study, Beyond Fiction, The Recovery of the Feminine in the Novels of Cervantes, was not written with the purpose of fighting for women's rights. That's one way one could also define feminism. Its importance remains in that it was the first study by an American Hispanist to speak out clearly on the feminine presence in Cervantes' writings in order to seek a reconciliation of gender opposites. Yet her earlier work anticipated her feminist turn by reminding us of the separation between reader, author, and text. In 1986, El Safar had this to say on how well we read Cervantes. After nearly 400 years, critics still have not arrived at a consensus regarding even the question of whether Cervantes meant it or not when he bore down so heavily on the novels of chivalry. El Safar's feminist criticism leaned heavily on psychoanalytical theory, displacing liberal rationalism with subconscious desire. Such an approach allowed her to explore the textual subconscious. For her, Marcela did not stand for the individual, but instead represented the psychic energies of the archetypal goddess. By not wishing to be subjected, Marcela assumes the same characteristics of the Great Mother, while at the same time her rupture with society, with Grisostomo, with the town, and with her own family, replicates the separation of the mother from the son, or, in Lacan's terms, the passage of the mirror stage. Thus, for El-Safar, women who reject and run from the men who pursue them, although seeming to deviate from social norms, in reality become part of the social subconscious. Rather than symbolize a feminist stance, Marcela serves to warn us of the dangers in a world divided by pre-established cultural and gender norms. Influenced by El-Safar, feminist psychoanalytical criticism continued to hold sway in the 1990s, as critics such as Diana de Armas Wilson, Mary Gaylord, and Mary Gossi attempted to make the text speak more than it knows, that is, to give voice to the female desire silenced in the narrative. But was this female desire known to Cervantes? It might be helpful here to quote the Swiss Hispanist Georges Guntert, who stated of Cervantes' tragedy La Numancia, las verdaderas intenciones del autor nunca se podrán descubrir. No nos quedará más remedio que fijarnos en las intenciones del texto. As El-Safar was quick to point out, Cervantes' characteristic ambivalence and ambiguity, expressed through the great number of fictional characters who narrate, write, and translate throughout his texts, necessarily distance the reader from the real author, opening the possibility of multiple and different interpretations. Recent feminist critics have chosen to survey the author's cultural topography rather than analyze the author himself. Materialist feminism has been one means of resisting such a temptation. Derived from socialist feminism, this approach investigates the social relations based on the material conditions narrated in the texts. These conditions can be examined not only in literary terms, but with respect to the lives of real women's historical condition, and therefore subject to historical changes. By incorporating the study of language and culture with socialist theories of history and women's agency, this kind of feminism, which came later in Cervantes' studies, has moved toward theorizing the social relations based on the material conditions narrated in the novels. As Rebecca Sullivan has explained, the material conditions in and of any narrative may be examined not only in terms of gender as difference, but in relation to the actual lives of women. Women's lives, then, are viewed as historically situated and thus subject to intervention and change. Because Cervantes places his women characters in trying circumstances as part of a larger narrative framework in which numerous social problems may be questioned and scrutinized, his texts lend themselves to this approach. Now, materialist studies have been written by male critics as well, such as Francisco Márquez Villanueva, Agustín Redondo, and Carol Johnson. Johnson's Cervantes and the Material World, published in 2000, echoes feminist concerns when he questions the happy ending of the captain's tale in Don Quixote. However, in that there seems to be no critical interest on these male critics' part for redressing women's condition, it is doubtful whether their studies may be properly considered feminist. By contrast, in their analyses of the cultural, racial, and class issues investigated in Cervantes' texts, numerous female critics have focused specifically on women as other, whether as prostitutes, gypsies, or increasingly moriscas, to show how these female protagonists are nevertheless involved in social and political concerns. The passing among fictional identities has allowed Barbara Fuchs, for example, to move beyond the text author to the text cultural positioning. Although she describes the gender and ethno-religious crossings in Cervantes as the author's conceit of disguising his main characters, she nevertheless states, "It is not my intention to portray Cervantes as a philo-Semite. Instead, I argue that his texts constantly de-emphasize and problematize essence." In my own studies of Cervantes, I have found his ideological approach to the women in his texts frustratingly inconsistent. It is true that the female characters do not function as mere pretexts in order to study social problems, as their large number and the marked differences between the characters require that we take into consideration their identity as women. Yet, although the female community in his pastoral novel, La Galatea, promotes a democratized space, allowing for agency and self-sufficiency. Thanks to Rosy Hernandez's fine work on La Galatea. When the shepherdess Marcela rejects her community, she is never heard from again. Indeed, all the women in Cervantes' texts are kept in check by their conformity to social standards. The female protagonists in the entremeses are held back by the law. In Don Quixote, they are controlled by their social position. Teresa Panza never abandons her peasant mentality, even though she exchanges gifts with the Duchess, who exploits her aristocratic privileges. Even Dorotea, who breaches socially acceptable female conduct, reverts to the same social and narrative constraints as the others. If her rhetoric in the form of a speech act liberates her from social disgrace, it binds her to women's social responsibility through marriage. These inconsistencies can be in part explained through genre analysis. The conventional patterns deployed by Cervantes and other male authors to lessen women's threat to the social order typically determine the narrative's resolution. Genres such as the Spanish comedia, the pastoral, and Italian short stories rely on social as well as narrative closure. As a professional writer, Cervantes knew better than anyone not to keep certain literary conventions. Yet before arriving at their ending, these same genres provide spaces for subversion and interpretation. Feminist analyses can recognize the ways in which traditional genres construct and position female characters in order to identify the sites of irresolution. Focusing on the cultural and historical sites narrated in the text, rather than on the attitudes demonstrated by the usually male characters, may help to avoid the contentions among critics who, as reported by Wollendorf, have sought to understand the multiple intersections between history and culture, art and representation, gender and psyche that continue to intrigue us in the 21st century. The historicist work by these feminists has greatly increased our knowledge of the early modern period by overturning the long-held preconceptions of women's lives and by continually expanding the literary canon with women's texts. Without disclaiming the overall social pattern of the patriarchal system, which still exists, they are finding archival proof of women's agency, whether among the Galician peasantry or among the women of the higher nobility. And in their studies of woman as other, such as the heterodox conversas and the moriscas, early modern feminists have already begun to interrogate how gender inequality interacts with racism, homophobia, classism, and colonization. That these social changes were occurring precisely in the early modern period, and that Cervantes, with his characteristic ambiguity, reported them in his novels and plays, regardless of whether he himself was a feminist, accidental or not, portends well for our continuing investigation of Cervantes's women, the fictional as well as the real. Thank you.